Hey folks, welcome to another beautiful day here in Foxborough, Massachusetts. And with that, let's get reading, shall we? Chapter 1. Who's ready to do this with me today? Here you go. Part 1. Cruelty is the point. Chapter 1. The house. Daddy, Mom's bleeding. They lived in the house, as my grandparents' home was known, for less than a year, and it still felt unfamiliar, especially in the middle of the night. So when 12-year-old Mary Ann found her mother lying unconscious in one of the upstairs bathrooms, not the master bathroom, but the bathroom she and her sister shared down the hall, she was already disoriented. There was blood all over the bathroom floor. Mary Ann's terror was not so great that it overcame her usual reluctance to disturb her father in his bedroom, and she flew to the other end of the house to rouse him. Fred got out of bed, walked quickly down the hall, and found his wife unresponsive. With Mary Ann at his heels, he rushed back to his bedroom, where there was a telephone extension, and placed a call. Already a powerful man with connections at Jamaica Hospital, Fred was immediately put into touch with someone who could get an ambulance to the house and make sure the best doctors were waiting for them when they arrived at the emergency room. Fred explained the situation as best he could to the person on the other end. Mary Ann heard him say menstruation, an unfamiliar word that sounded strange coming out of her father's mouth. Shortly after Mary had arrived at the hospital, she underwent an emergency hysterectomy after doctors found that serious postpartum complications had gone undiagnosed after Robert's birth 9 months earlier. The procedure led to an abdominal infection, and then further complications arose. From what would become his usual spot by the telephone table in the library, Fred spoke briefly with one of Mary's doctors and, after hanging up the phone, called Mary Ann to join him. "They told me your mother won't make it through the night," he said to his daughter. A little while later, as he was leaving for the hospital to be with his wife, he told her, "Go to school tomorrow. I'll call you if there's any change." She understood the implication. "I will call you if your mother dies." She understood, and Mary Ann spent the night crying alone in her room while her younger siblings remained asleep in their beds, unaware of the calamity. She went to school the next day full of dread. Dr. James Dixon, the headmaster of Kew Forest, a private school she had begun attending when her father joined the board of directors, came to get her from the study hall. "There's a phone call for you in my office." Mary Ann was convinced that her mother was dead. The walk to the principal's office was like a walk to the scaffold. All the 12-year-old could think was that she was going to be the acting mother of 4 children. When she picked up the phone, her father simply said, "She's going to make it." Mary would undergo 2 more surgeries over the next week, but she did indeed make it. Fred's pull at the hospital, which ensured that his wife got the very best doctors and care, had probably saved her life, but it would be a long road back to recovery. For the next 6 months, Mary was into and out of the hospital. The long-term implications for her health were serious. She eventually developed severe osteoporosis from the sudden loss of estrogen that went with having her ovaries removed along with her uterus, a common but often unnecessary medical procedure performed at the time. As a result, she was often in excruciating pain from spontaneous fractures to her ever-thinning bones. All right, I'm going to pause right here. And a lot of you folks have probably heard me rant in and out of a topic that pisses me off to this day. And that is just the disregard for the female anatomy and chemistry, even in modern medicine, right? So you may very well be aware or heard me talk about the fact that, drug trials, they're always done on men. Why is that? Drug trials are always done on men because they don't risk getting pregnant. But because women's chemistry is very obviously different, all those drugs that are supposedly safe for, both genders, really, we don't actually know. We don't know. So yeah, think about that one for a little bit. Anyway, to continue. If we're lucky, we have as infants and toddlers at least one emotionally available parent who consistently fulfills our needs in response to our desires for attention. Being held and comforted, having our feelings acknowledged and our upset soothed are all critical for the healthy development of young children. This kind of attention creates a sense of safety and security that ultimately allows us to explore the world around us without excessive fear or unmanageable anxiety because we know we can count on the bedrock support from at least one caregiver. Mirroring, the process through which an attuned parent reflects, processes, and then gives back to the baby's own feelings, is another crucial part of a young child's development. Without mirroring, children are denied crucial information both about how their minds work and about how to understand the world. Just as a secure attachment to a primary caregiver can lead to higher levels of emotional intelligence, mirroring is the root of empathy. Mary and Fred were problematic parents from the very beginning. My grandmother rarely spoke to me about her own parents or childhood, so I can only speculate, but she was the youngest of 10 children. 21 years younger than her oldest sibling, and 4 years younger than the second youngest, and she grew up in an often inhospitable environment in the early 1910s. That is of 10 children. I thought that, my mom had a big family, and that's 5 kids. My dad second big because 4 kids, but 10 kids. How do you even control that? I can barely hold on to 2. Anyway, whether her own needs weren't sufficiently met when she was younger or for some other reason, she was the kind of mother who used her children to comfort herself rather than comforting them. She attended to them when it was convenient for her, not when they needed her to. Often unstable and needy, prone to self-pity and flights of martyrdom, she frequently put herself first, especially when it came to her sons. She acted as if there was nothing she could do for them. During and after her surgeries, Mary's absence, both literal and emotional, created a void in their lives. As hard as it must have been for Mary Ann, Freddie, and Elizabeth, they were old enough to understand that what was happening and could, to some extent, take care of themselves. The impact was especially dire for Donald and Robert, who, at 2.5 years and 9 months old, respectively, were the most vulnerable of her children, especially since there was no one else to fill the void. The live-in housekeeper was undoubtedly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of housework. Their paternal grandmother, who lived nearby, prepared meals, but she was as terse and physically unaffectionate as her son. When Mary Ann wasn't in school, much of the responsibility of taking care of the younger kids fell to her. As a boy, Freddie wouldn't have been expected to help. She gave them baths and got them ready for bed, but at 12, there was only so much she could do. The 5 kids were essentially motherless. Whereas Mary was needy, Fred seemed to have no emotional needs at all. In fact, he was a high-functioning sociopath. Although uncommon, sociopathy is not rare, afflicting as much as 3% of the population. Check yourself. 75% of those diagnosed are men. Symptoms of sociopathy include a lack of empathy, a facility for lying, an indifference to right and wrong, abusive behavior, and a lack of interest in the rights of others. Having a sociopath as a parent, especially if there's no one else around to mitigate the effects, all but guarantees severe disruption in how children understand themselves, regulate their emotions, and engage with the world. My grandmother was ill-equipped to deal with the problem caused by, and in her marriage, by Fred's callousness, indifference, and controlling behavior. Fred's lack of real human feeling, his rigidity as a parent and a husband, and his sexist belief in a woman's innate inferiority likely left her feeling unsupported. Gee, none of us know somebody like that still, huh? Since Mary was emotionally and physically absent due to her injuries, Fred became by default the only available parent. But it would be a mistake to refer to him as a caregiver. He firmly believed that dealing with young children was not his job and kept to his 12-hour-a-day, 6-day-a-week job at Trump Management, as if his children could look after themselves. He focused on what was important to him, his increasingly successful business, which at the time was developing Shore Haven and Beach Haven, 2 massive residential projects in Brooklyn that were to date the most significant of his life. Again, Donald and Robert, in particular, would have been in the most precarious position vis-a-vis Fred's lack of interest. All behavior exhibited by infants and toddlers is a form of attachment behavior, which seeks a positive, comforting response from the caregiver, a smile to elicit a smile, tears to prompt a hug. Even under normal circumstances, Fred would have considered any expression of that kind an annoyance. But Donald and Robert were likely even needier because they missed their mother and were actively distressed by her absence. The greater their distress, however, the more Fred rebuffed them. He did not like to have demands made of him, and the annoyance provoked by his children's neediness set up a dangerous tension in the Trump household. By engaging in behaviors that were biologically designed to trigger soothing, comforting responses from their parents, the little boys instead provoked their father's anger or indifference when they were most vulnerable. For Donald and Robert, needing became equated with humiliation, despair, and hopelessness. Because Fred didn't want to be disturbed when he was home, it worked in his favor if his children learned one way or another not to need anything. Fred's parenting style actually exacerbated the negative effects of Mary's absence. As a result of it, his children were isolated not just from the rest of the world, but from one another. From then on, it would become increasingly difficult for the siblings to find solidarity with other human beings, which is one of the reasons Freddie's brothers and sisters ultimately failed him. Standing up for him, even helping him, would have risked their father's wrath. When Mary became ill and Donald's main source of comfort and human connection was suddenly taken away from him, not only was there no one to help him make sense of it, Fred was the only person left that he could depend on. Donald's needs, which had been met inconsistently before his mother's illness, were barely met at all by his father. That Fred would, by default, become the primary source of Donald's solace when he was much more likely to be a source of fear or rejection, put Donald into an intolerable position, being totally dependent on his father, who was also likely to be a source of his terror. Child abuse is, in some sense, the experience of too much or not enough. Donald directly experienced the not enough in the loss of connection to his mother at a crucial development stage, which was deeply traumatic. Without warning, his needs weren't being met. His fear and longing went unsoothed. Having been abandoned by his mother for at least a year and having his father fail not only to meet his needs, but to make him feel safe or loved, valued or mirrored, Donald suffered deprivations that would scar him for life. The personality traits that resulted, displays of narcissism, bullying, grandiosity, finally made my grandfather take notice, but not in a way that ameliorated any of the horror that had come before. As he grew older, Donald was subjected to my grandfather's too-muchness at second hand, witnessing what had happened to Freddie when he was on the receiving end of too much attention, too much expectation, and, most saliently, too much humiliation. From the beginning, Fred's self-interest skewed his priorities. His care of his children, such as it was, reflected his own needs, not theirs. Love meant nothing to him, and he would not empathize with their plight, one of the defining characteristics of a sociopath. He expected obedience. That was all. Children don't make much distinction, and his kids believed that their father loved them or that they could somehow earn his love. But they also knew, if only on an unconscious level, that their father's love, as they experienced it, was entirely conditional. Marianne, Elizabeth, and Robert, to greater or lesser degree, experienced the same treatment as Donald because Fred wasn't interested in his children at all. His oldest son, the namesake, received Fred's attention simply because he was being raised to carry on Fred's legacy. In order to cope, Donald began to develop powerful but primitive defenses marked by an increasing hostility to others and a seeming indifference to his mother's absence and father's neglect. The later became a kind of learned helplessness over time because although it insulated him from the worst effect of his pain, it also made it extremely difficult, and in the long run, I would argue impossible, for him to have any of his emotional needs met at all because he became too adept at acting as though he didn't have any. In place of those needs grew a kind of grievance and behaviors, including bullying, disrespect, and aggressiveness, that served their purpose in the moment, but became more problematic over time. With appropriate care and attention, they might have been overcome. Unfortunately for Donald and everybody else on this planet, those behaviors became hardened into personality traits, because once Fred started paying attention to his loud and difficult second son, he came to value them. Put another way, Fred Trump came to validate, encourage, and champion the things about Donald that rendered him essentially unlovable and that were in part the direct result of Fred's abuse. All right, guys, that concludes our broadcast day for today. We will see each other tomorrow. Stay sane out there, and maybe avoid the news. Bye now.